Russia has been at war with Ukraine for over 32 months, and today we want to review the military situation there. I'm Julian Repke, and you're in the BILD Situation Room. We are starting with visuals from Kursk, a region in western Russia. In that area, the 810th Marine Infantry Brigade of the Russian Army has been trying to retake the area occupied by Ukraine since August over the past 3 days, with catastrophic consequences. We are looking at footage showing how completely uncoordinated and, according to Russian war blogger information based on lies, misinformation and nonsense at the general level in Moscow, this counterattack occurred there. So, we see these images here that demonstrate how armored Russian vehicles are making an attempt to directly advance on the Ukrainian position in a frontal assault. And these vehicles were, according to Russian war bloggers, under the impression or had the information that first of all the minefields were already cleared, meaning that there are no longer any mines lying on the roads, and secondly that the flanks to both the left and the right of these advances are being held by Russian units. We'll let it run for now and then look at what unbelievable things happen in this video. This is likely a BMP-2 vehicle from the Russian army which was totally and utterly destroyed right here. All occupants are most likely killed, and we'll take a quick look at what's happening here. It's essentially a road that stretches here, going in from the west to the east in this particular case. In this particular situation, the Ukrainians continue to maintain their control over the eastern forests and settlements in this area. And we can now see that the BMP-2 is moving here, and we can see two strange lines on the road, and it's quite clear that there are mines there, which you can even see in these images. You can see the large round shapes, likely M62 mines, that have been placed directly on the road here, and now we observe how the vehicle detonates the first mines. The explosion is absolutely massive here and in flight, so during the near total destruction of the BMP, another explosion is triggered mid-air, and this vehicle ends up being hurled several meters even further away. And this clearly shows that probably no one managed to survive this terrible incident. But that wasn't the only minefield that was still completely intact when the Russian army arrived. In the last few days, we had already heard that up to 30 BTR-82A, very modern Russian armored personnel carriers, were indeed heading to the 810. Marine infantry brigades were given to retake the course. And these BTR-82As have now been deployed by the Russian army, but in a manner that leads only to self-destruction and not to the liberation of Russian-held territories in Ukraine. We see that the vehicles are packed with infantry. This means not only a crew of about 3 men, but also 5 to 10 infantrymen each, that are on and inside them. And we now see how these vehicles, one after the other, while still firing, drive onto minefields. Now we see the first BTR-82A that is destroyed by a mine here. But that doesn't stop the others from taking the exact same path. Here we have a clear view. So this is indeed the same path we just observed. And the others are now moving left and right of it. And all BTA-82A, all modern infantry fighting vehicles, are first destroyed by mines here, which then leads to massive losses. It's not only just that, we can see the Russians have fired at the Ukrainian positions directly ahead. Now we see the next going up, and soon the third and fourth will follow. That means the Ukrainians are right in front of it. They're right at those forests there. We're practically prepared for this attack. We see here how all Russian armored vehicles are immobilized, and worse for the soldiers, they're under Ukrainian fire now. We're unable to show most of that footage, as we've either pixelated it or completely cut it out, but we observe approximately 30 or 40 soldiers attempting to participate in this assault. How they are hiding beside the vehicles, yet sadly it's all in vain. And then they are tragically killed one after another. This is truly a disastrous attack for the Russian army. We have from Ukraine, from the 95th Brigade active in Kursk, the information, now we're seeing it here once again, that they tried to get to safety along the damaged infantry fighting vehicles, but subsequently they were all shot one by one, or eventually fell victim to their injuries as a result of the preceding events that had occurred. We have the information that from the 95th Brigade, as just mentioned, a total of 28 Russian vehicles were destroyed in these attacks, and more than 100 soldiers of the Russian army. We'll look at that again in detail on the map. We have the information that the attack was carried out from 3 axes in total. And that in 2 of the axes, minor advances in terrain could be achieved by the Russians, but unfortunately at the cost of very, very large losses. We can also see here that kamikaze drones were used to stop these vehicles in other areas. And now we see here how additional attack conditions or attack routes of the Russian army are similarly being targeted by various weapons, including kamikaze drones. But on the other hand, they were also thwarted by large minefields here. We see various explosions here. We just saw one, but we didn't see the other. This happened down here. That means even here, 2 of the 3 vehicles are hit by different explosions. And we will then also see in the footage afterwards that many Russian soldiers have died here, that the infantry fighting vehicles and also some off-road vehicles that were used were deployed here, and all of the vehicles there were completely destroyed. So overall, a black day for the Russian army, which has actually been ordered for months to recapture Kursk. Here is the footage I mentioned earlier. You can see an armored personnel carrier and an off-road vehicle, both of which have been destroyed. The Russian army was aiming to reclaim the entire area, but sadly they've completely failed to achieve that. Finally, we see more footage from Pogrebki. There are several lakes there which make it relatively easy for the Ukrainians. The few roads that are there to be mined, even that the Russians didn't seem to know. Here, the first vehicle has already hit a mine and has come to a halt. The second vehicle, because it simply can't pass since there's a lake on one side and a forest on the other, tries to turn around and find another route. But then this vehicle drives over another mine and the Russians inside suffer a very, very terrible fate. As mentioned, the whole incident, yes, a major embarrassment for the Russian army, which, according to some reports, I think the New York Times reported, gathered around 50,000 of its own and North Korean soldiers in Kursk to eventually bring this area back under Russian control, especially with Donald Trump now in power or about to come to power. And there should definitely be various exchanges and deals, and the Russians naturally want to prevent Kursk from becoming part of these deals at all costs, so that parts of Kursk perhaps be returned from Ukraine or received, and as part of that deal, parts of Ukraine would need to be vacated. The Russians definitely want to prevent that. However, we see here that they absolutely failed in the first days. And now we're just going to take another look at the map to see that even after 2 days of major offensive by the Russian army, the largest areas that were held in Kursk still remain under the consistent control of Ukraine just 2 or 3 weeks ago. So we had 3 directions of attack that we just saw. One went along here by Darino. Apparently they've recaptured a part of Darino, this small village. The second major line we just had went from Lyubimivka to Novo-Ivanovka in this direction. All vehicles were destroyed there as well. And the third thing we saw were these small lakes. You can see it just a little bit. It headed in the direction of Pogrebki coming from the north. And apparently Pogrebki, a very small village north of Malaya Lochna, was recaptured by the Russian army. The whole situation, however, was so disastrous for the Russians that Russian war bloggers are talking about how the so-called defenders, that is the Russian soldiers, had to set up a circular defense here after their offensive. And that means nothing other than they were surrounded by Ukrainian troops while they were stuck somewhere because their vehicles were destroyed. We also have these scenes from the Ukrainian side. You can view them. Specifically, the scenes are from this region here. The Russian forces have advanced into a wooded area there, successfully managing to drive out the Ukrainian troops. However, after that initial success, they found themselves without vehicles and with very few weapons remaining, which led to the Ukrainian forces launching a counterattack to reclaim that forested area and regain their strategic position there. What we see here are 2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles of the Ukrainian army. I think you can see them a bit here on the left side. Here is one, there's the other. Here is the Russian position located in the middle of this forest area that was recently captured, but unfortunately now it has to be given up again. And the 2 Bradleys are now first shooting at the Russians who are hiding there, and then they drop off the Ukrainian soldiers on the left and right. Here we see it once again. One of the Bradleys drops off its soldiers here, while the second Bradley drops off its soldiers over there, and in the middle were most likely the Russians that were still hiding there. And that's precisely what the Russians mean by circular defense. By the way, this is the 47th Brigade of the Ukrainian army that is also active here. We can see the Russians actively trying to defend themselves. Here we see an explosion on one of the Bradley fighting vehicles, but it doesn't lead to the destruction of the vehicle. Instead, the vehicle continues to move and then allows the infantry on both sides to disembark. So both vehicles manage to reach the position of the Russians that they are aiming to recapture. They are shooting in at the last moment, we see that, and as soon as they arrive, the Ukrainian soldiers on both sides, we see that parallel to the left and right, are being unloaded to reclaim control of that position and eliminate the remaining Russian troops from this unsuccessful counterattack operation. So these are very difficult times for the Russian army. As mentioned, Russian war bloggers are furious, angry with the Kremlin, angry with the generals, because they are saying once again there was false information, there was propaganda, and not for the enemy but for their own army, which was under the impression that everything was now okay, that sufficient groundwork had been laid to reclaim these areas. And in reality, that was not the case at all. We remain briefly in Russia, transitioning from Kursk to the city of Moscow in the greater Moscow region. And there, the Ukrainian army launched yet another long-range drone attack yesterday morning. We are not sure about the target since apparently a majority of the Ukrainian drones were successfully shot down. however with serious consequences for the Russian civilian population. We now have the recorded footage clearly showing us exactly how these Ukrainian drones, which are known as Luti, make their flight path. Roughly 500 kilometers these drones have flown from Ukraine to reach that location, and we can observe how these drones, with their very typical and unmistakable shape, maneuver around. For example, they have a tail fin, which is an inverted V that we can see there. I hope you can see it a little bit. I think you can see it a little bit here. You can clearly see this inverted V shape behind it. According to reports from the Russians, there were up to 32 of these drones flying over the area. The Ukrainians are not commenting on it, but it was probably significantly less. And now we see how these drones are being shot down. At least 2 of the explosions were seen in Russian footage, not from the military, but from civilians, who filmed the whole thing, and we can see now how one of these drones is being shot down in the air. However, this does not imply that it was completely destroyed, but rather that a portion of the drone, as we can see right now, is crashing down onto the regions it had been flying over just moments earlier. That was the overall impact it caused. We had a vehicle in the vicinity that was struck, and subsequently several fires broke out in the surrounding region as a result. And this region, as mentioned, near Moscow, southwest of Moscow. And we see some passers-by now in the film, as some residential areas have gone up in flames there. We have no information about casualties. Luckily for the people there, it probably didn't hit anyone, but it shows the danger that, of course, also comes from the Ukrainian drones, and that is also posed by them, that the Russians can naturally manage to shoot down the drones, but this does not lead to the total destruction of the drones. Instead, a part of the aircraft, maybe still carrying part of the remaining explosive payload, remains. Flies down and explodes right where they were just launched from. The same naturally applies to Russian kamikaze drones flying over Ukraine and being shot down beforehand. There were often, if you will, unfortunate collateral damages because they were shot down a few kilometers or even around 100 kilometers before reaching their intended target, and as a result, ended up striking civilian infrastructures. We want to continue moving forward to Ukraine. We haven't visited there yet, so let's first take a closer look at the Toretsk and New York region. That's the name of a small town that was taken by the Russians there, and even there are very significant Russian losses. We already saw it. In 2 days, the Russians lost over 100 men in Kursk. In this region, they lose a considerable number of soldiers, specifically in the Toretsk and New York area. And here we observe how the Russian army attempts to launch an attack using various types of armored vehicles. But they are also hit by kamikaze drones, by a whole series of kamikaze drones. And so, one vehicle after another is being destroyed. What we just saw was a kamikaze drone attack on an MRAP, a mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle. Now we are looking at a BMP-1 from the Russian army, featuring what is commonly referred to as a garage build, which is this large structure intended to provide protection against kamikaze drone attacks. But we see the vehicle hit a mine. This means mines are a major threat that, of course, these structures can't counter. You can't encounter at all. In this regard, we see further footage showing that this vehicle was also full. 10 Russian soldiers are also getting out now, and we see how the Ukrainians are very careful to make sure that this vehicle doesn't drive off again, but that it's completely destroyed. We keep witnessing new explosions hitting this particular vehicle and observe how determinedly the Ukrainian army is striving at all costs to ensure that this vehicle never moves again. This is the BMP-1 we just saw. However, we can also see other Russian vehicles on the left and right, and that's also a real graveyard for tanks or armored personnel carriers that has formed here. And they see these massive losses that the Russians incur for every meter they want to advance. Yet again, someone left the door open, and as a consequence, this results in the possibility for the vehicle to be completely destroyed. More buses, Buchanka, of the Buchanka type, are attacked here. We see that the Ukrainians are fairly successful in destroying many Russian vehicles. Which, of course, doesn't mean that the Russians don't have more vehicles, but they just keep coming with new ones. We recently saw a BMP-2 that was shot, and here there is some quite disturbing footage that's truly difficult to fully understand. It appears that approximately 5 Russian soldiers seemingly had gathered for a meeting or something quite similar to that. They're all still standing here, none of them are wounded. But they're standing so close together that it makes it relatively easy for the Ukrainian drone to inflict significant damage with a single grenade. Above all, we pixelate that, of course. Nevertheless, yes, quite interesting or strange footage that shows that the Russians there probably lack much combat experience or for some reasons acted completely wrong, since they should know there are Ukrainian drones above them. We also see here, pixelated by us, many dead Russian soldiers. The Ukrainian army claims that roughly a total of around 1,500 Russian soldiers are killed and wounded each day. She doesn't distinguish between the killed and the wounded. Nonetheless, the numbers are quite high on the Russian side overall. And ultimately, we see once again how another armored vehicle belonging to the Russian army has come up to a house in this area. Now the soldiers are getting off there, and for reasons that are once again completely incomprehensible, the rear door is left open here. That means we'll see the soldiers getting out both front and back, and one soldier keeps the rear door open. We can see it, he jumps out, and the vehicle we just saw is now being attacked from behind by a Ukrainian drone, which is exploiting exactly this mistake, flies directly into this open door, and subsequently the vehicle is destroyed from that position accordingly. It is evident that heavy fighting is still ongoing in Donetsk, with particularly fierce and intense battles occurring around the city of Toretsk. We want to move a bit further towards the south. Over there in the Kurakova region, the situation for the Ukrainian army is extremely critical and dire. And there are recordings from a small town, and these really don't seem to bode well for the situation at all. However, they haven't been confirmed yet. I'll briefly explain our approach here, as we analyze where the Russian army is and where it's not. And we frequently gather recordings from the various warring parties. In the case of the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian army released footage here 2 days ago showing them on what is likely a T-64 tank, with both the machine gun on top of the tank, on the turret, and the main weapon, soon visibly seen bottom left, in use. We consistently take a look at where exactly that is and when it took place. What we observe here is that we're positioned in the center at a small roundabout, right in the town of Sonsivka. You can clearly observe it in this particular roundabout. So these are the structures we're looking at, the small park in the middle, especially the museum focused on Ukrainian history, which is quite well known in this particular small town. And this museum is being shelled by a Ukrainian tank. And if this museum is being shelled by a Ukrainian tank, then we can assume that the Ukrainian soldiers in this video assume that Russians have occupied this building. And that leads us to reposition the front line to see where there is movement, where there has been movement along the current front. Here, as mentioned, we see how the heavy machine gun is used. Currently, he is making some slight adjustments to his camera. We can now clearly see how the main weapon is coming into view. We're seeing exactly we're on a Ukrainian tank, and now how the main weapon is being used within Sonsivka, right in the center of this small village. This was not generated by us, but rather by one of the skilled geolocation experts who are, among others, active at X. Going by the alias Blitzling, as we are able to observe here quite clearly. And he tried to locate the whole thing, like to see where the tank is and what that means. And you can see here from this drawing, which he recently published on X, that we actually have the museum positioned right here on the left-hand side. So here we see a relatively large and striking building on the left side, and then further buildings more to the right. And down here, sort of like, well, how should I put it? Kind of like a roundabout, definitely that circular thing we observed just there. And that shows us quite clearly we are in Sonsivka. The Ukrainian tank is firing from the southwest toward the northeast, precisely in the direction where the Russian forces might be expected to make their entry, specifically coming from the northeast. We see yet another shot that illustrates it again. It's somewhat distorted, to be honest. Seen from the southwest, the city's museum comes into view clearly, illustrating the situation well whenever we take a look at everything. We can safely assume that at some point in time, the Russian army was indeed already located in Sonsivka. And if that's the case, if that's true, it would be very dramatic for the Ukrainians as they face a major encirclement. We take a detailed look at the map and observe that Sonsivka has been distinctly marked by us right here at this location. So a place here a few kilometers northwest of Kurakova, that's Sonsivka. And we also see that our map provider, Deep State Map, just this fact that we saw the Russians, that we saw a fight against the Russians in Sonsivka, that this fact is admitted here by using the orange color. Marking fighting, the gray area color, the color of knowing fighting occurs there, but we don't know exactly who checks that this color was entered here. If we had seen, for example, how the Russians would have raised a flag there, how they would have stood on the museum and said, "There, we have Sonsivka taken," and the Russian Defense Ministry had quoted it that way, then both sides would have more or less confirmed it. Ukraine doesn't officially confirm losses, but you can see it by the military equipment, and then the whole thing would have been marked in red. It is not yet. Nevertheless, we have a really dramatic situation here because we see that the Russian army has now bypassed Kurakova in the south and in the north. That means while we still have Kurakova under Ukrainian control here, it currently looks like the Russians are relatively successfully advancing the flanking from the north. Are now here in just a few days, you can see the difference, having advanced about 5 kilometers. It's unclear how many Russian soldiers there were, if it was only 5, and if they were repelled. Nonetheless, that should all be the case. It is quite a dramatic situation because we see that the Russian army would have already passed the reservoir north of Kurakova. And now it would be a relatively short path to move in a southward direction from here and cut off the crucial and only existing road that leads toward Andriivka. This is still not entirely clear. Nevertheless, the signs, the indications, the indicators suggest that Russia has broken through north of Kurakova and that relatively soon there may be a Ukrainian withdrawal should indeed be anticipated, considering that the Ukrainian army doesn't wish to be surrounded with 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers there. And we have emphasized that repeatedly over the last few weeks while there's a relatively successful defense takes place because hundreds of Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers are destroyed. Right in front of Kurakova, it's the flanks, which are once again relatively weak and can therefore be penetrated by the Russians. We also want to go to the south of the country, first to the Zaporizhia region, then to the Kherson region. There is fighting there too. We rarely show these kinds of scenes because not much typically happens on the ground. Nevertheless, we now have new footage available that vividly shows the Ukrainians carrying out an attack on a Russian column with HIMARS artillery. And this Russian column was reportedly led by a group of Marines. And it was apparently quite important, the Ukrainians explained to us, because there were loading vehicles involved for multiple rocket launches, so we see the Ukrainian drones monitoring everything here. We can also observe various types of vehicles being utilized here. It is said that this is supposed to be a low loader carrying the ammunition. Here are 2 more vehicles, if I'm not mistaken, which are supposed to show armored vehicles. And the Ukrainian army has now fired different ammunition types with the M30A1. For the first time, they used HIMARS rockets with tungsten, marking a significant step in their capabilities. Nearly 200,000 tungsten rounds are in there, fired at this convoy because it was believed to be a munitions delivery heading to the front, and it's all about 40 kilometers behind the front. That this ammunition shipment was intended to be destroyed here. Apparently the convoy ended up getting hit at least hard enough that it couldn't proceed or continue driving. What we just saw were these low loaders that were standing there and will remain there. And we are going to see very soon how reinforcement arrives there and how to be hit again with various other rockets. Let's take a look at the scenes we just had. And we are currently observing repeated new impacts here, which are likely M31 rockets, also launched by HIMARS systems, featuring a maximum range of 85 kilometers. Now we can observe quite clearly here the impact as they are making attempts to hit this column repeatedly and inflict as much damage on it as possible. The Ukrainians are also continuing to thwart Russian attack efforts to expand the front into the Zaporizhia region further south in the country. As I said, the whole thing is very difficult because we see it happening at night, but here they managed it. Now we also see the relatively large fire at one of the storage piles and the secondary explosion. That indicates it seems as though the ammunition is currently exploding in that area, having just been hit. From Zaporizhia, our journey takes us further to Kherson, and there we will observe a scene that's somewhat almost amusing if the circumstances weren't so deeply sad. What we see here is a small an island at the delta, at the Dnipro River delta, and this island is pretty much exactly between Ukrainian-held territory in the north. There we see it up there. That's the Ukrainian city, and a few kilometers further south there's the first Russian-held city, and this island is under Ukrainian control, and it is very important for that reason, because the Russians cannot completely take control from the southern bank of the Dnipro, as they can't patrol with their boats here, and they perhaps can't prepare an attack on the northern half either. Therefore, it's very important for the Ukrainians to hold onto this island. And the Russians are now trying to hit this island with artillery. And these are very peculiar recordings that we're seeing. Because the Russian drone, is filming how all the artillery shells are missing the island. And that's quite strange indeed. So here we observe the first one, which even hits at a distance of about 1 kilometer away from the island. And now it continues, and we see again and again. I'll try to mark it again. I don't know if it's always noticeable. Here is the next one. The Russians keep shooting at this island, which is about the size of 10 football fields, and actually miss it with all their shots. It's not entirely clear why it was published in this manner, why this video even had to be distributed at all. They seem keen to show their effort to attack Ukraine. The last shot is the closest miss, but nevertheless, as you can relatively see from these fountains, it also hits the water. That means this small island named Pervomaisky remains under Ukrainian control. And at least on that day or during that attack, she wasn't hit by Russian artillery at all. Let's take a quick look at the map and see that behind the markings for the city of Odessa, the small island is actually located around this spot here. As mentioned, in the south is the red area occupied by Russians. In the north, blue indicates reclaimed land, or grey, not under Russian control. It's evident that the Russians are focusing on completely gaining full control over the Dnipro Delta. They just tried that with artillery, but the whole thing went thoroughly wrong. Finally, we want to watch a video published by the Ukrainian army, which interestingly shows that the decoys, specifically the artillery decoys, the ones Ukraine is building, are becoming more sophisticated with increasingly new features. We see here initially a kind of warehouse, and one might think there are artillery guns of the M777 type. In here, M777, an American artillery gun, which probably more than 100 of them have been delivered and are now being used in Ukraine. And to ensure that the Russians do not attack the real artillery but instead target decoys, these fake units are strategically scattered across the entire country, particularly along the front lines, so that the Russians expend their bombs. Attacking guns that aren't even guns, just made of metal and wood, they only cost a few hundred or a few thousand euros to produce. However, in the past, the problem was always that the Russians eventually realized nothing is moving, this gun isn't real. That's why the Ukrainians came up with something new, and we're just going to let it play now. Fundamentally, there is now the available opportunity to shoot or launch these cleverly crafted decoy dummies. We just observed this taking place. There is an unexpected presence of smoke here, prompting immediate action. And there, where you expect it, right at that spot, we first see that just the projectile is fired, and that afterwards there's smoke where you would expect it. And the whole thing is, as I said, completely fake. So the Ukrainians invented it, came up with the idea that something like this could be made to make the Russian drones believe the claim is that these are real M777 howitzers, which they actually aren't. And with that, they hope to lead the Russians astray so that they attack decoys instead of indeed manned artillery guns, which are naturally extremely important in the defense battle of Ukraine against Russia.